You may have heard the news that the US Department of Justice launched a criminal investigation into Fed Chair Jay Powell, and people are freaking out. Or if you're smarter than I am, you haven't watched the news in hell, a decade. And I've seen some confusion about why this matters. If a wealthy boomer in Washington gets indicted over testimony about a building renovation that apparently went like $700 million over budget, that would be, well, the first time in history a wealthy boomer has faced consequences over anything. And no big deal, right? So why do Republicans and Democrats in government, Wall Street, all former Fed chairs, economists around the world, business leaders, and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent allegedly have their panties in a bunch? The thing is, when people hear words like federal funds rate or bond market, their reaction tends to be and rightly so. First of all, nobody knows what those are, right? Let's be honest. I'm doing an economics PhD, and I still equivocate when asked and change the topic. And second, why does anyone care? Why should I care? Like, is Jerome Powell going to make my slutty outfit DLC cheaper if he avoids indictment? Yes. Yes, he is. Or perhaps not, but the Federal Reserve does influence your daily life in concrete ways, and it's less recondite than it sometimes seems. The Fed is the United States central bank, not a bank like Santander that you visit in person to deposit a check or rob. The Fed is more like an economic referee, and it has two major roles: keeping inflation low and stable, and supporting maximum employment. And literally every story you hear about the Fed, you'll hear the phrase dual mandate. That's what that is. People need jobs, and money needs to hold its value. In other words, when eggs are $100 a dozen, and you're on your 12th round job interview, but it's two AIs aggressively asking each other how they can be helpful, that's the dual mandate at work. But the Fed doesn't directly control prices, wages, or the labor market. Its primary tool is control over short-term interest rates. And I know people envy the deaf when this comes up, but it's easier to understand than you think. Lowering these rates is like bragging about your Rolex on a first date, but your wrist is green underneath. No, wait, let me try again. Lowering these rates is like taking steroids before entering a bodybuilding competition next week and a big technical competition next month. All right, fine. Lowering these rates is like turning the stove to high heat. Things feel great economically in the short term, but inflation rises. It's easier to get a job, banks lend more, businesses borrow more, consumers spend more money, stock prices go up. But the trade-off is my video game DLC gets more expensive. Conversely, raising these rates is like turning the stove heat to simmer, or even putting the pan in the fridge. Economic activity cools down, but so does inflation. Borrowing becomes more expensive, businesses reduce hiring, consumers spend less, and the trade-off is that you don't have to go to the supermarket with a wheelbarrow of money to buy bread. Here's the crux of this story. If you were trying to win an election and didn't care about long-term implications, would you want voters to feel like the economy was booming or shrinking? It is politically advantageous to have lower interest rates. Heat the stove to max and just let the next administration handle the charred remains. And since no policy simultaneously keeps borrowing cheap, inflation low, and employment high, the Fed often makes decisions that are unpopular in the short term to avoid larger problems later. But if it were up to the people running for office, we'd have the stove running at max all the time. And things would feel good for a little while, but eventually video games would cost $600,000. Make sense? Well, luckily it's not up to politicians, or it's not supposed to be. The Fed operates as an independent institution, unpressured by short-term politics, especially because the things we've been talking about don't happen overnight. It's not like the Fed lowers rates and the following morning businesses spend more. The impact of their decisions may take months or years to appear, and it's evident that they try to appear unswayed by who's in office when they speak. The Fed must maintain an image of independence, otherwise trust in the institution crumbles. So back to the news about federal prosecutors and Jerome Powell. Jay Powell is the chair of the Federal Reserve. He's not its only member, but he holds massive influence over its actions. And despite appointing Powell as Fed chair, Trump's been attacking him lately because he wants interest rates to be lowered even if they don't need to be, which, remember, would make the economy feel good in the short term. Why? Many Americans who voted for Trump expected him to revitalize the US economy. And he hasn't really done that. In fact, he's added an asinine amount to the deficit. With midterm elections coming up and polling reflecting a growing negative sentiment, the Trump administration would benefit politically if people thought their economic situation was improving. Not that coercing the Fed into lowering interest rates would actually do that, just to be clear. So it started with all the old classics. Trump called Powell incompetent. He called him too late Powell. He said he was a stubborn mule, a fool, a numbskull for not lowering rates fast enough.
We have a bad Fed chairman. He's bad in a lot of different ways, but he's bad because his interest rates were too high.
If I had the help of the Fed, it would be easier, but that jerk will be gone soon.
He said he'd love to fire Powell, that Powell should resign. They had this flirtatious banter on camera about the Fed headquarters renovation.
You're including the Martin renovation. You just added
our entire capital.
Yeah, you just added in a third building is what that is. That's a third building.
Well,
including
no,
the
but
Martin building.
it's a building that's being built.
No, it was built 5 years ago. We finished Martin 5 years ago.
It's part of the overall work. So,
Despite that, Powell wasn't exactly loquacious about all this.
Some of the president-elect's advisors have suggested that you should resign. If he asked you to leave, would you go?
No.
Can you follow up on, do you think that legally you're not required to leave?
No.
That is, until recently, when Federal Reserve official accounts released a rare statement where Powell said this directly to the public.
This new threat is not about my testimony last June or about the renovation of the Federal Reserve buildings. It is not about Congress's oversight role. Those are pretexts. The threat of criminal charges is a consequence of the Federal Reserve setting interest rates based on our best assessment of what will serve the public, rather than following the preferences of the president.
This is pretty unprecedented in modern U.S. history and signaled a much more direct assault on the Fed's independence. I mean, for a normally cautious Fed chair to go on video and basically accuse the White House of weaponizing prosecutors tells you how serious he thinks this threat is. Powell's basically saying this has nothing to do with his testimony and the renovation project is about rate cut pressure. Let me control the interest rates or face consequences. Now, Powell's term as chair expires in May, but he could remain on at the Fed until 2028. And who knows? This investigation may inspire him to do that, just so Trump can't stack the Fed with people loyal to what he wants and not what the economy needs. I guess we'll see. And to be clear, if Trump becomes openly allowed to control interest rates, that would be a veritable economic disaster. So, of course, Trump denied knowing anything about the DOJ subpoenas. But if you've listened to him talk about Powell, that's like this guy saying he didn't know there was going to be an all-you-can-eat buffet. I mean, you can't say I didn't order the hit, but then explain why the guy deserves it and why the next Fed chair better promise lower interest rates. For what it's worth, as of now, Republican Senators Tom Tillis and Lisa Murkowski said they wouldn't back Trump's new chair pick until the issue with Powell is resolved, but the two Kevin frontrunners seem to be yes men, so that's where we are now, at least at the time of recording. And that's why so many people pushed back against this, and we saw the market get spooked. Not as much as economists thought, but that's a longer topic. Gold and silver hit record highs, and the dollar index fell. There's an argument that this was supposed to be a private threat, and Powell got the upper hand actually by taking it to the court of public opinion and essentially winning. So the market wasn't that surprised because it's already priced in Trump's disdain for the Fed. That's all I was going to talk about in this video, but that's important to understand too. The value of money depends on trust. There are concrete uses for gold, right? Like badass grills and elegant toilets. It has intrinsic value. But money is pee-pee poo-poo paper. If you don't trust, it will hold value in the future. And if people stop seeing the Fed's decisions as data dependent and start seeing them as controlled by the government, they'll expect inflation to rise because political pressure would force the Fed to cut interest rates even when the economy doesn't need it. And if a $10 loaf of bread suddenly becomes worth $500,000, it doesn't matter if you had $1 million saved in the bank, you can now buy 2 loaves of bread. And if that sounds ridiculous, it is. But there are historical examples of governmental interference in central banks ending really poorly. For instance, Venezuela hit 1,000,000% inflation in 2018 after the government took control of the central bank. Now, it's much more complicated than that. It wasn't like the government fired the central bank and the next day things were 10,000 times more expensive. And I'm not saying that's what's going to happen in the US, but investors are not unaware of the risks. And this doesn't just matter to Americans. The world's most influential central bankers actually released a statement backing Jay Powell and warning that political interference with the Fed threatens global financial stability. So don't make the mistake of thinking that the dollar is just what Americans use to buy McDonald's. For now, it's still the world's reserve currency. Anyway, that's all. I just wanted to clear up why any of this matters and give you some talking points to make your friends feel stupid. I'm in the process of establishing new socials, so go to my bio and follow me on Instagram and all my other crap. I'm going to try to do a better job of actually posting on there, I promise, so it's worthwhile if people want to see more. And I'll follow back the first I don't know, however many people I can, so that'll be cool when I'm famous. Unless your profile's like in the Epstein files, then I probably won't follow you back. And I should probably just cut all of this for retention, but I'm not gonna. Haha, hee hee, ho ho.